The Legend of Zelda, a series you've likely heard about at least once or twice. Breath of the Wild came out as a launch title on the Nintendo Switch, and it's taking the world by storm. People love this game. But it's the newest in a long line of massive achievements in gaming. And whether you like the games for their unique style, their unique gameplay, or its convoluted timeline that simultaneously manages to be an oddity as well as a source of endless interesting information and conjecture, there's a lot to love, and through the years, it's only gotten better. Hi folks, it's Falcon, and today on gameranx, the evolution of The Legend of Zelda. Way back in 1984, when the original ideas were gestating on the Nintendo Entertainment System, a lot of interesting and different ideas were being thrown around. First, you had the obstacle course linear style games which are being thrown around as Mario ideas, but there was more than just that. Eventually, the non-linear style of thinking emerged, and once The Legend of Zelda received its name, this became known as Zelda thinking. The ideas revolved around having a symbol of courage, strength, and wisdom, and linking it all together with a coming-of-age motif, giving you a big, wide world to explore as well as many options as a player, and essentially making you learn for yourself and make your own choices, truly making you feel as though you accomplished something. The first Legend of Zelda game takes place entirely from a top-down perspective. You start the game with nothing but a shield. That being said, you get a sword very quickly, and immediately you feel empowered. This was an experience that you had never had on a game console. Most of us that were alive when this happened got our first taste of power in the virtual world through Legend of Zelda, where Mario allowed you to attempt to navigate a course quickly. The Legend of Zelda gave you a world where everything wanted to kill you, but that's alright. The game was made up of an overworld and dungeons. The overworld was a map of various geography that had varying sets of obstacles and monsters roaming around, depending on where you were, that would give you clues as to what the dungeon exactly would be like. The dungeon would be a little bit different. Dungeons were series of rooms that could have secret passages and contained more powerful monsters. More than that, however, they also contained various weapons that would help you get more power in the world, unlocking various areas as well as making it easier to defeat certain types of enemies. The symbol of courage, strength, and wisdom I mentioned earlier was the Triforce, which before you had done anything as Link had been broken into 8 pieces separated throughout all of those dungeons. You could do this in any order. Once the Triforce was again whole, you could then enter the 9th dungeon. In it, Zelda was waiting to be rescued. Much of the lore was left up to imagination. For instance, Ganon, the final boss, wasn't really given any explanation. He was just kind of there and you had to beat him. This was the first time you ever had to beat him, so it was a new experience. It's not as if this was really necessary, but still it made you curious. There had to be more to this. Well, in a roundabout way, the rest of the games have told the story. In 1988, the sequel came out. And perhaps the most important thing to say about it is that Nintendo was willing to experiment with a successful formula. Yes, the game did contain an overworld, which was a big element of the first game, but it functioned in a very different way. The purpose of the overworld was a little more similar to that of a Final Fantasy title than the previous Zelda. It acted as more of a hub, essentially, whereas towns and dungeons were side-scrolling segments that played a lot more like Castlevania. It did indeed retain some of the battle elements, but it did also add an experience point system, as well as a defend stance which was required in order to defeat a lot of the enemies in the game. Link had to alternate between standing and crouching in order to not die, and on top of that he could also learn new sword moves, which greatly expanded his capabilities in combat. This time Zelda has fallen under a sleeping spell, and Ganon's followers wish to resurrect him using Link's blood, but the same pattern basically emerges. Complete the dungeons, get the Triforce, save Zelda. The same year Zelda II came out in America, 1988, development on a new Zelda began. It started on the NES, but because the SNES, the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, was in development, and this lent much bigger possibilities, the game was moved to that and given a very large budget. Because the Super Nintendo was capable of having a significantly larger amount of space, specifically 1 megabyte, on the Legend of Zelda cartridge, the development team was able to make a very large world filled with a lot of different colors. The game took place between two parallel universes, the light world and the dark world. In order to save space, the dark world existed specifically as an overlay on the light world that used different sprites but generally was pretty much about the same. There were a couple changes, but not a lot. The Super Nintendo also had native 16 color titles, but they were compressed to 8 colors in order to save a little bit of storage space, and they used a little trick to make it so that essentially you had a very expansive 16-bit, amazing looking world. The game also played significantly smoother. The combat felt a lot more responsive. Link had different moves he could acquire, such as a dash, and weapons that greatly expanded what types of things you could expect from, say, puzzles in the game. The creativity on display when you needed to use the hook shot, for instance, or needed to have the hammer to get across a bridge, continued to develop as you got further into the game. Environmental puzzles seemed to keep cropping up, and they seemed to get more clever and more interesting, just as the bosses of the game did. In fact, if you want to talk about variety in gameplay, Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past is just a tour de force. It's here that the two types of games diverge on account new handheld games started coming out, starting with Link's Awakening. Those games essentially built on the formula established in A Link to the Past, and they're all very good games, but for the sake of specifically going through large-scale evolutions in the Zelda series, we're going to stick with the console games. After Link to the Past, the very first 3D Legend of Zelda game was put into development for the new Nintendo 64 system. Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time came out in 1998. For the time, this game was the best-looking game that had ever come out. Some of the things that you could see in this game were so amazing that a lot of the time I remember as a kid literally stopping and saying to myself, how did humanity get to this point? This is amazing. We got so much more in depth this time around. Not just in a great new combat system that used a lock-on that could be triggered with the Z button, which was a very unique way of doing things at the time that has definitely bled into just about everything, but also if we talk about the tools. For instance, the hook shot became a grappling hook, and some of the things that you needed to do with it bordered on genius as far as puzzles. The game also introduced the titular instrument, the ocarina, which learning various songs on could do anything from transporting you across the world to opening certain doors. From huge dungeons with massive environments that just varied incredibly, all of the elements on display coming together to create one big world that just was different than anything else you'd ever experienced in your life. And considering that at the basics, this was the same game, that's actually amazing. The theme of Zelda essentially is everything old is new again, because every time they find new ways to blow your mind. A couple of years later, in 2000, Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask came out, and although it didn't contain the same levels of exploration and freedom that Ocarina of Time afforded you, and a lot of the gameplay elements were essentially the same, with a few different things thrown in, nothing major. The real difference was the story, the setting, and how things went down. Majora's Mask is the story of an apocalypse happening in a town, where the only thing that you can really do is work to stop it. And if you don't get there, you have to go back in time 3 days and continue to try to get better and find a way to save the world. Does it blow your mind by showing you something you've never seen before? Not necessarily. Much of what's there was there in Ocarina of Time. However, given the world is not quite as big, they put more personality into it. And as you meet these characters and see how they've tried to adjust to the fact that the world is ending, you start to feel more obligated to saving them. This is an example of how Nintendo took basically the same mechanics and plopped them into a completely different environment and just gave us a game that was totally unique. A lot of people love it and a lot of people hate it. And that's how, in my opinion, Majora's Mask was a risk that was worth taking. If there's one thing Nintendo's known for, it's keeping things fresh, and Majora's Mask is a very good example of that. After the release of Majora's Mask, they started development on the next game, which would also be on the next system. The GameCube was introduced with a tech demo of a realistic-looking Zelda that got a lot of people very hyped up. However, it was not the Zelda that was coming. In 2003, a Zelda that looked almost unrecognizable to people who were expecting a realistic game, the cel-shaded Legend of Zelda Wind Waker, came out and disappointed some people. However, once people got used to the look of the game, this was easily one of the better Zeldas. And considering how long the series had run, and how great pretty much all of the games are, that's saying something. With the new look, a lot of new ideas were implemented, such as having Link more aware of his surroundings and looking at things in order to indicate that he had something that he was interested in focusing on. On top of that, the visual look made it much easier to express emotion, given the fact the game still contained no voice acting. The setting was an experimental one, a world that was entirely engulfed in water. Only little islands existed and you had to sail between them. The Wind Waker itself built on the Ocarina's musical elements, and although the game wasn't necessarily received as well as it could have been when it first came out, over time, people really grew to love this game. Twilight Princess, the story of a corrupting dimension seeping into Hyrule, was this game. It was a much more serious and realistic affair that used the Wind Waker engine and featured essentially evolved combat. When Link enters the Twilight Realm, he becomes a wolf. Combat is different as a wolf, as he can't use his shield or his sword. He just has to bite and dodge. But he is a lot faster, and he can dig holes. Eventually, he's able to go back and forth in between being a wolf. In fact, there are even puzzles based around it, and it creates for a more varied experience. Next, in 2011, The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword came out. I think you could probably call it somewhere between Wind Waker and Twilight Princess, with a color palette that leaned a little bit more towards Wind Waker. The really big addition to this game was using motion controls to swing the sword and use your weapons. The game essentially described the originating of everything in the Zelda universe, from the Master Sword to the early evil that Ganon and Ganondorf evolved from. The game essentially sets up the entirety of the Zelda series. All the varying branching timelines stem from this one game. And that leads us to Breath of the Wild. 2017, the year that Zelda came out with its biggest, most detailed, and oddly enough, one of the most dense games in the entire series. This game has introduced technology to the world of Hyrule, but at the same time, everything exists in a sort of melancholy world that, although is beautiful, is in the final stages of decay of civilization. There's also one very big, very noticeable addition to this Zelda: voice acting. Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild is absolutely the culmination of everything that Zelda has always been. It's all been building to this. This is the ultimate Zelda game. And I'm not going to spoil anything for you, nor am I going to give you an even decent idea of what goes on in the game. But I am going to say that this is one of the most satisfying open world games that has ever been made, and it does it by simplifying a so richly refined version of every concept that you've ever seen in a Zelda game. I would definitely suggest playing it. What's your favorite Zelda game? Leave us a comment with what you think is the best one. And also, if you enjoyed this video, please click like. If you're not subscribed, now would be a very, very good time to do so. We upload brand new videos every day of the week, and the best way to see them first is, of course, a subscription. We thank you very much for watching this video. I'm Falcon. You can follow me on Twitter @FalconTheHero, and we'll see you next time right here on gameranx.